Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh. What a pleasure to begin today's show with an old friend. Mark Levin, the great one himself, joins me. He's the author of this brand new bestseller on power. Mark, welcome back. I haven't talked to you in a while, and I've got a lot of questions about this, but let me do a wellness check. Everything well in your world?
Let me look. Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you, brother.
You, you look great. I should tell the audience, I've been talking with Mr. Levin since 1984 when he came into the Department of Justice, took over the Attorney General's office as his chief of staff, and made the trains run on time and actually got a lot of stuff done. What he writes about in On Power is exactly what he talked about in 1984. Mark, would you say that you are unchanged in your fundamental beliefs since then?
I am unchanged. Look, you have certain principles, certain belief systems. I think if there's any change, it's sort of on their application, and not that often and so forth. But look, either you're right or wrong about your values, your morals, and your principles. And that's my attitude about it. I've not had to change any of that. Um, in fact, my view is I try to promote it, on every platform I have as much as possible in my writings and on radio and TV and so forth. So my goal is to advance and institute my principles, not to change them.
I believe that you have consistently believed in liberty first, liberty always, and you expand on that in the book On Power. I want to begin with a couple of quotes. Page 15. This book is intended to provoke a better comprehension of what is meant by power. If it succeeds even modestly, perhaps it will provide an additional source for liberty and against tyranny. And on page 177, my focus is on those politicians and academicians who claim to embrace and uphold the Constitution while using it by manipulation and perversion as a means to dismember its most critical parts, especially separation of powers, the consent of the people, and federalism. So there's a positive goal and there's a negative goal, just like you described there being a positive liberty and a negative liberty. Did you intend that symmetry, or did that just come out of your natural flow? Because it's really a wonderfully written book, Mark.
Well, thank you. No, that's intentional. I took this word power, this concept, this force, which is not easily defined, and I broke it down into negative power and positive power, and beyond that, soft negative, soft positive power. And I did that because, Hugh, I started to think about ancient history and our own history. And I realized the revolution wasn't over liberty or rights, it was over power. Who gets to make the decision? And so the fight was over representative government, taxation without representation. And I got to thinking liberty without rights means nothing, and rights without power mean nothing. And so in the book, I actually quote Stalin's Constitution from 1936. It is a beautiful constitution. He stole a lot from our Bill of Rights, and
Yep.
it's just fantastic. And then the next year, he slaughters about 8 million Ukrainians, and everything that's in that constitution is a lie. Why? Because he has all the power. The people have no power whatsoever. And then, Hugh, I got to thinking about our founding, as I said, and the founding is they were fighting over power. And you go back and you read these men. Sam Adams, as you know, one of the earliest and the most effective revolutionaries up there in Boston, he writes extensively about liberty, and yet he really doesn't talk about liberty. He's talking about power. And then I went back and I started to read Aristotle, who I love, and there's a lot to read. And I said, what does he say about liberty? Well, he talks about liberty, but he defines it in the context of power. And then I go back and I read again our Constitution, which I read all the time. I thought that whole document is about the way power is to be divided, the way power is to be diversified, who has it, who doesn't. And so I said, we focus a lot on this word liberty and this word rights. And then I got to thinking, well, now the Marxists and the Islamists, the left, they focus on power, power, controlling power, centralizing power, destroying the barriers to power, separation of powers, and so forth. So we, you and I, your audience, my audiences, we look at power as something that Montesquieu said power has to check power. Power must check power. Scalia used to talk about everybody who understands this, the great period of the Enlightenment. And yet the left, the Democrats, who I call them pretty much American Marxists at this point, they're leaders, and the Islamists, they're about eliminating power, checking power. They're consumed with controlling power, centralizing power. It's power for them, it's power over. I say in the book, for us, it's power of language, power of competition, power of separation of power. For them, it's power over. They're not really interested in the competition of power. They try and change the election laws, the voting laws. They continue to want to press to change the Supreme Court so they have power over us. And I discuss these in much more elaborate detail in the book. So yes, negative power, and then positive power. What's positive power? The Constitution is positive power. We needed a central government, but then they divided that government, and then they added a 10th Amendment to ensure and underscore the point that the action is where the states are. The 9th Amendment, which I argue is really reflective of the Declaration of Independence, individual liberty. Just go through our Constitution. It's so completely different than what the left, the Democrats argue for today.
Mark Levin, when I finished this, I was reminded in 1980, Richard Nixon wrote a book called The Real War. And the New York Times reviewed it, and they called it a cri de coeur, a cry from the heart, because he was very concerned about the Soviet Union. He didn't want any more Vietnam, so he was very passionate. On Power is a cri de coeur. It's a very passionate book. It's very deeply researched, by the way. I'm going to come to some stuff from Sam Adams myself, Democracies Do Not Guarantee Liberty. I've never seen that. Never seen that quote before. So my hat is off to your research. But are you worried? Are you anxious over the future of this country to the extent that the American Marxists, and they are many and they are in positions of power, are winning?
It's a great question. I should also mention near the end of the book, I take a very close look at Hamilton to the point where the National Constitution Center would like me to talk about this. We can get to that later. People can read about it. Am I concerned? Yes. I had a little discussion with my dear friend, and he is Victor Davis Hanson, on Life, Liberty, and Levin. I think it was Saturday. And he and I both agree of all the great things that are occurring during the Trump administration. And the next census, if it's done accurately, the Republicans will pick up House seats. They'll pick up Electoral College votes because of that. Depending on how we count illegal aliens, but the people are moving with their feet, and it has a consequence in our system into red or Republican states, which is exactly why the Democrats want to get rid of the Electoral College, and they have a movement underway, the National Vote Initiative, all these other things, and that's my point. To answer your question, I'm very worried because these people don't give up. And Donald Trump won't be president forever. And the fact is, a lot of Republicans who are elected don't comprehend the extent to which these people are in the culture and in the society. Donald Trump really is the first president to go into the culture, into society, not just at the political level, but to go in, whether it's the law firms or the colleges and universities and so forth and so on, to go into these areas and fight them. He's the first one to go into the fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy, and try and literally rearrange it, defang them, move the departments around to some extent, reduce their impact, Department of Education, USAID, we can go through each and every one of them. He's the first to effectively do that. He's the first to really shut down the border, because what's happening here is we don't assimilate anymore. In fact, public schools and colleges and universities and the media don't believe in an Americanism that should be assimilated into, as they constantly attack us. And so what happens is you have these bifurcated cultures that are imported into the United States who demand that we assimilate into their cultures or that we accept their cultures. And that is a massive problem, a destruction of our country, and Trump's put an end to that. And so I see, when you look at Trump and the presidency, an enormous amount of positive things going on. And yet I think people make the big mistake saying, but look at what's happening, Mark. So why are you Mr. Pessimist? I'm not pessimistic. I'm a realist. These people are not going to go away. They're about to elect somebody to the biggest city in America who's a complete reprobate, a malcontent, a communist, an Islamist, a Jew hater. And he's been open about it. And people say, good, now we'll run on that. And I said, what do you mean good? They'll be taking the biggest city in the United States. I look at these things, Hugh, as military battles without the arms. Would Patton say, oh, it's a good thing they took New York and we'll stop them at Arkansas? No. We got to fight every inch of this thing. And so I see this thing rising. I see in the Democrat Party an acceptance of this ideology, an embrace of this ideology. Even the so-called opponents are afraid to speak out. At best, they're neutral. Well, you can't be neutral when you're facing this. And honestly, Hugh, I see within our own party, less so in our party because some of these people are broken off, some level of this too, some level of attacking Judaism, attacking evangelical Christians, attacking American history. And many of these people claim to be American firsters. They're not American firsters. We've seen this kind of around in the 1930s too, as well. So I see a lot of positive right now with Donald Trump as president, but I also want people to forbear and realize these other people are not going away, and we have to address this and confront it.
You know, one of the great advantages of having Donald Trump as president, and I was not a big fan of Trump in 2015, 2016, but I'm growing to like him more, is he's adopted the Sean Connery admonition when he played Joe Malone in the Untouchable Chicago Rules. He brings a knife, you bring a gun. He puts one of yours in the hospital, you put one of his in the morgue. We're doing that in Texas with redistricting. So Gavin Newsom's going to try and amend the California Constitution, which is fine. It's politics. But then we've got to play the same way. Positive power. We've got to use the red states, of which there are many more than the blue states, to redistrict just as aggressively as the Democrats do, because that's positive power when you redistrict in the benefit of your party. You agree or disagree with that, Mark?
A great point. I discuss in the book where positive power can be abused by those who exercise negative power. They use it for a period of time and then they destroy it. And I go on to say we've not really been able to figure out as human beings, and we never will, how we overcome this idea. Liberty is a great thing, but it also gives room for very evil people and movements to develop, to abuse and exploit liberty towards the opposite of liberty, to different ends, tyrannical ends, totalitarian ends, that sort of thing. But but negative power, I say from time to time, like at times you have to centralize power and so forth. That's necessary too. And then I kind of do a kind of a mind debate with myself. But is that really negative power when it's used that way? And the answer to me is no. But it comes to us as negative power. So I try to develop these things. The book is very cerebral, but on the other hand, very understandable, which is why it took me so long to write it. And I also decided to keep it tight because you can go, I could have written 1,000 pages on this. I thought that would be foolish because nobody will use it. You know, they'll use it as a doorstop or something like that. But I want people not just to buy the book, I want them to read the book, because my hope here is that we better understand the enemy, that they are about power, grabbing power.
I want to, yeah. I want to make sure the audience understands one of the most important revelations of Mark's book on power is that we have come via hard-earned experience to learn there is no ruling class. There are people who think they're in the ruling class. There are people who claim expertise. But in point of fact, you write, we know that incompetence and corruption are widespread, and practical experience and common sense are in short supply on page 136. COVID taught us that. Joe Biden's administration, he was not really the president. I think you would agree with me on that. The office was empty for 3 years. His team, his shadowy force majeure behind him, they were not expert at anything. There just isn't anything about which we ought to defer to other than our common citizenry, Mark. Is that one of your key points?
Yeah, it's a very important point, because the early American Marxists who assigned a nomenclature to themselves, very clever, that they're progressives, but they're really the progeny of Marx and so forth. And I wrote a different book on that called American Marxism, but they've customized and tailored Marxism to a Western ideal or to American ideal. They used to write at great length, they still do, that you need this highly educated expert class, this elite class, and they didn't mean it in a pejorative way, they meant it as an important way. to help organize or reorganize society. And I said, well, where is this? The federal bureaucracy is filled with knuckleheads, some of them filled with some smart people and so forth. To become a member of the federal bureaucracy, you don't have to be particularly intelligent or profound or accomplished. Quite the contrary. It's filled with dead weight. So even their own ideological point is false. Where are all these experts and all these wise people and all that? What are their names? Who are they? They don't exist. As a matter of fact, what they do is they regulate the experts and the wise people and so forth that are in the private sector and have actually experienced and have done different things. But I want to get back to a point you raised, the American founding. I think what's crucial to understand, and I start this in the book, is we believe in the power of the sovereign. Now, who's the sovereign? America was founded on the Judeo-Christian value and belief system. That doesn't mean everybody has to be Jewish or Christian or anything. That's the history of the nation. And that meant that God is sovereign. And on earth, his children, when it comes to governance, they are sovereign. That's how each individual is sovereign. And the civil society, the people in the civil society are sovereign. This wasn't just somebody wrote about it and suddenly, no, that is the history of two of the greatest faiths on the face of the earth, Judaism and Christianity. Read the Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights, natural law, natural rights that doesn't come from man. So they believed in that. But what else did they do? They said, well, how does it manifest itself? This is great to believe these things, but we're trying to set up a government. They fused that with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment and the Judeo-Christian value system is the basis of the American founding. What's the key thing they learned out of the Enlightenment? There was a lot. But it was what Locke talked about in a more ambiguous way, and he was the most important philosopher during the Revolution. And it's what Montesquieu wrote about during the constitutional period, which is why he's quoted in the Federalist Papers. Power checking power. And he broke it down into three branches. He broke it down into specific ways that nobody had done before, even though even Aristotle and others talked about power checking power. Legislative, judicial, executive, we all know about that. And this is how they came up with the Declaration early on. This is how they came up with the governing document that they did. This is why they're so important. And this is why the left came up with the 1619 Project and CRT, and that the Constitution was written by white slave owners. This is why they're constantly talking about centralized government programs, whether it's healthcare or anything else. Bureaucracy, centralized government, it doesn't work. They don't care that it doesn't work. They want to rejigger society, rejigger humankind, top down, not bottom up. So it's very important to understand this, because Marxism and Islamism are completely incompatible with Americanism. They are a completely different belief system, because in the case of Marxism, it's coercion. It's not coercion plus, it's coercion. In the case of Islam, it's religion fused with coercion. That's not the way America was founded.
No, it was, and as you say on page 146, the entire Marxist project is an evil fiction. That's terse. It's on point. And I found myself, as I went through On Power, you're really writing a repudiation of Marx. And I began to wonder what happened between the blessing of the Enlightenment that framed our Constitution. By the time Marx dies, he has let loose a virus on the world, Marxism, which continues to thrive and spread every day, especially in America. What happened in that period of time, Mark? Because you say he was around for the beginning of the second industrial revolution, but he didn't see the wealth, the abundance it would produce. He did not live to see his own ideas repudiated. But what hatched him? What broke him?
First of all, people need to understand a country like ours, there's only been one in the whole history of mankind. And Athens is gone, and Rome's gone, and the British Empire is gone. So one of the things I point out in the book is this trajectory is always towards negative power. You'll have at a time like the birth of the United States of America, how unbelievably fantastic that is. That's sort of the counter-revolution. But then when you look at the trajectory of free countries, it's not good. They don't survive. Um, Evil always survives. And this is what I tell people who say, well, what about forever wars? I said, open your Bible. It's not that we want stupid wars. That's stupid. It's not that we want to intervene where we don't belong. That's stupid too. But this battle between good and evil is forever. That's why you go to church to deal with it. You go to synagogue to deal with it. That's why you believe in a faith. If everything were positive and perfect, there would be no faith. There'd be no belief systems. So these things are forever. These battles are forever. It's not that Marx came along. You know, Rousseau, he stole from Rousseau, he stole from Hegel, especially Hegel. Hegel's the bigger problem, but people don't realize it. Marx took it and applied it to economics. He said everything comes down to materialism, everything comes down to economics. Well, he was wrong about that. He died, I think it was 1873, the second industrial revolution, which is the real industrial revolution. It began in about 1870. He didn't know what capitalism, a word he invented, would create. What did it create? It created the opposite of what he said. The greatest middle class in human history. That's what the
Yep.
Industrial Revolution created. People can talk about robber barons all they want. The left does this all the time. He created, that is, capitalism created for the vast majority of people, the masses, a lifestyle that's better than any king or queen lived 150 years ago. Better than any king or queen. I say this all. Walk into a supermarket. Look what you have. I don't care if
Yeah.
you're a plumber, electrician, a janitor, the best surgeon in the world. You go in there, that's available to anybody. You may not like the price, but look at the availability. So many different types of hamburger meat. You want 85% fat, 90% fat, 50 different types of bread, 14 different types of eggs, milk, on and on and on. You can get prescription drugs. People may complain about prices, but let me tell you something, folks. There's not another group of human beings ever who've had life so good as they do now. And it's so ubiquitous in a
Oh yeah,
society.
I loved your. It's on page 145. People need to read Mark Levin talking about the neighborhood supermarket. Not unlike the essay on the pencil, but you're right. The neighborhood supermarket is a testament to the grand, extraordinary production of good things, not goods, but good things. The neighborhood supermarket is the best example of what Western capitalism and liberty can do with positive power. Mark, I want to get two more things down before we run out of time. I got to do an entire show in a half an hour, so I want to make sure I cover this. First of all, I am very glad to see C.S. Lewis in your book, not once, but a few times. And in fact, you quote one of my favorite collections of his essays, God in the Dock, when you write, of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons, Lewis writes, and you quote, than under the omnipotent moral busybodies. And I thought, and you mentioned, homeowners associations. They are, in fact, the little platoons of negative power. They are the worst little busybodies in the world, and they're a shadow, sort of a forerunner of what happens when you get to big government, when you get to omnipotent government in places like China with its social credit score. Do you think we are headed that way because of the fact we are growing accustomed to people telling us what to do with our property, which should be verboten? It's in the Fifth Amendment. They should not be able to tell us, Village of Euclid versus Ambler, worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. No one should be able to regulate our property. But I don't know how we get out of this jam.
Well, C.S. Lewis was brilliant. He was a brilliant, for many Christians, he's a great philosopher. Well, I'm Jewish, and I think he was a great philosopher. And Montesquieu said the same thing, as did some others. That is, these people who pursue power and the imposition of power and coercion in the name of virtue and self-righteousness are the most dangerous people on the face of the earth, because at least these evil people, we understand where they're coming from. And here's the problem. Lewis was right. Montesquieu was right. They were all right. That's why Mondami is attracting support. Even though he's a communist, an Islamist, and a Jew hater, look what he's promising. He's promising all these wonderful equality and all the rest of it, which of course they never deliver on, and they cannot. So your question is, am I concerned about this? Yes. And I want people to read the book. Buy it, great, but read it, because Once you understand how power actually comes into play, because it's dealt with very surface level, very superficially in debates that they have at the Federalist Society and other places, or debates we have on TV and on radio and so forth, and so liberty, liberty, okay, great. But if you don't have power, and if power is not exercised properly, none of the rest of it follows. Faith, you can't practice your faith openly. Of course, you can in secret in the basement, but you can't exercise your liberty, your private property rights, all these other things. There have been great Supreme Court rulings in the past couple of years, as you know, great
Yeah,
actions by the President of the United
Loper
States,
Bright.
as you know.
Yep.
Exactly. But the problem is the culture in society. That's where the action is. And so that's why, look, why do I write books? I don't have to write books. I don't need to write books unless I'm trying to get people to read and learn something that they're not taught in school, that they're not taught in the media, and they're not taught in the other books. And so my view is I have complete faith in the American people. Once the American people are awakened to certain things that are being done to them, because they're busy. And so my view is there are tens of millions of us, Hugh. If we talk to each other, if we talk to our families and friends at the dinner table, in church or synagogue or wherever we are, we have more power than any network, any collection of networks. We have more power if we awaken to these facts, we figure out what's taking place. And in this case, I've decided if we argue at a different level now, we can talk about liberty and rights, and we can talk about capitalism versus socialism, but let's get down to the nitty gritty. Do you want to be a sovereign human being, or do you want to be enslaved to clever demagogues?
That's
That's
it.
what it comes down
That's
to.
it. And my idea, when I finished on power, I'm talking with the president of Chapman about maybe doing a seminar for freshmen on curiosity. I think you could take On Power and spend an entire year. You can read it in 2 days. I want the audience to understand. It's very easy to read. It's very wonderful to read, and it's powerful. But if you went through and you stopped at every name you had not yet encountered, Cicero, Montesquieu, Locke, and you did a little deep dive into each of those people, it would be an education that we have not been providing that was routine in my educational years. I mean, you had to, I didn't get out of high school without knowing who these people were. I don't know that a high school student could be expected to know half of the people who you reference. And they'll know who Jefferson is, but they won't know Jefferson writing in 1819 a letter on liberty. They'll never find that in their high school textbook. So that's my first suggestion. I want to end, of course, with a disagreement. I'm a Hamiltonian. I like Federalist 78. You do not talk about Federalist 78 in the judicial power, Mark, not because you're afraid of it, it's because it doesn't fit into the book anywhere. But when you go to the Constitution Center, is that what they want you to talk about, the Federalist 78?
Hugh, when you read beyond Federalist 78, uh, in fact, when you get beyond the Federalist, obviously he was one of the main authors of the Federalist, he and Madison, John Jay to a lesser extent. What I say in my book is he either didn't believe everything he was writing or he reversed course.
You're right.
Because
You're right.
because what we know about him was, I explained, I give two examples, pre-Federalist and after Federalist. The Bank of England argument, his arguments were outrageous. And he drove Madison and Jefferson nuts because he's talking about implicit powers. He's talking about necessary and proper. He sounds like Ruth Bader Ginsburg in that stuff. And then before that, at the Constitutional Convention, and it's funny, the National Constitution Center said, we didn't know this. We want to talk to you about this. Jeff Rosen over there. I said, well, it's in there. You just got to dig hard in Madison's notes. I mean, he proposes lifetime senators. He proposed a lifetime president. The rest of the delegates, that went absolutely nowhere. Now, his reason for it was we need to have people who are committed to governance. We can't have people who are dipping into the private sector and into government. We'd have conflicts and all. But everybody knew that was crazy. So,
But in 78, he argues that during good behavior, I want to resurrect this standard for judges. It is not good behavior for district court judges in the United States to set aside settled law to attempt to reverse the executive power. It is not good behavior to repeatedly reject Supreme Court black letter law because your political agenda. It is an impeachable offense. Do you think we ought to resurrect that part of Federalist 78, that lifetime tenure is predicated on good behavior? And by that, we do not mean non-criminal behavior. We mean fidelity to the law.
Well, you know, Jefferson tried that and he failed. And
Picked the wrong
the
target.
Supreme Court justices and everybody else keep pointing to that over and over again. I have a better idea because I think that could get messy. I could see the left more effectively going after a Clarence Thomas or a Sam Alito or something like that. Way back in my first book, Men in Black, and the left has kind of stolen this and twisted it. I supported term limits for Supreme Court justices, and I still do. Even though some of our good guys would go down, some of their guys would go down too. But just as a matter of practice. And then I said, if we're not going to do that, in another book I wrote, The Liberty Amendments, I said, okay, then let's do something a little differently here, which is we should at least allow, who says the court should have the last word? Justice Marshall, that's it. That's not in the Constitution. Which is a whole
1803.
other area for another day. Yeah, 1803, Marbury versus Mendon. But I make the point in there that that 3/5, my idea, 3/5 of the Senate or the House should be able to hold a Supreme Court decision null and void, because 3/5 would be a fairly good representation of the body politic, or 3/5 of the state legislatures, and they could act within 24 months. Can't let it sit there for, not to rewrite the opinion, not to write an opinion, just thumbs up or thumbs down. It'll be hard to get 3/5, but I said, why is it that a 5-4 majority of lawyers on the Supreme Court can determine what is fundamental constitutional law and what is not? To me, that is absurd. And if you switch one justice, then it's 5-4 the other way. So I'm thinking, how do we preserve the independence of the court, but allow the body politic, when it comes down to big issues, to speak out, not through democracy, through representative government and a supermajority of a vote? I put that in the Liberty Amendments as my suggestion.
That's a pretty good idea. I'd forgotten that. I read the Liberty Amendments. I've interviewed Mark about, I believe, every one of his books. And I will close with this. I think On Power may be your most powerful book, Mark. It may be your shortest. Am I correct about that? Your shortest book?
I think you're right about both, actually.
Yeah. And I congratulate you on Power, on being a bestseller. You're always gracious with your time, and I appreciate that as well. The great one, Mark Levin, On Power, is out there. Go get it, read it, learn from it, spread it around. Thank you, Mark. Always good to see you.
You're fantastic. Thanks, Hugh. And people, he's a buddy of mine. Take care.
Be well.